Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Look at that guy. John Trossi, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How
A
are
dear
you?
I'm
friend of
doing well.
mine,
Oh my God.
Mr. John Trossi. Mr. Jockin has been to the house, and he will tell you that he knows about the sword fighting. Trossi is and Mr. Luber as well. Trossi here is a really talented sword fighter, and he also teaches in school and in the education system. So I was asking him about his experience of education. I know Mr. Jockin, you teach as well, so I was just asking Mr. Trossi here, what's it like to be a teacher? And I appreciate him being there. So, Mr. Trossi, what do you think of school these days?
Oh man, school is a lot better with me as a teacher than the teachers I had, I think. But teach is on. Um, but yeah, I had an opportunity to go to a conference this summer down in Texas. Very teacher oriented, but it seemed like a lot of teachers were more interested in the concerts that were going on afterwards than they were in the sessions, unfortunately. It was pretty backwards in that kind of way, but what are you gonna do? Um, I definitely got a lot out of it. There were a lot of people who were there for pop and circumstance, but there were a lot of people who were clearly there to become better teachers, better educators, and that's definitely the reason I went there, along with a couple of my other colleagues from my elementary school that I work at. The last 4 years, I've been teaching fifth grade math and science. The first 2 years, I also taught language arts with that, but the last two has been put into preparing myself for another year of fifth grade math and science. My new principal who comes in, decides that they need me to be a sixth grade science teacher. So all the work that I did last year to make sure that science was very hands-on instead of very PowerPoint and very as if we are still in the middle of a pandemic, which we're not, are we? I don't know. Who knows anymore? But I'm not trying to teach off a slideshow with science. I'm trying to teach with hands-on activities, and putting all those materials and plans and everything together can be very taxing and time consuming. And then when you start the year with no curriculum and you end the year with significantly better scores across the board from the year prior, and then they say, hey, all that good work that you did last year and all that you had envisioned to continue doing next year, well, too bad.
Well, Mr. Trossi, I salute you for teaching on the fifth grade level and moving to the sixth grade with school. And I'm always very interested in the topic of education. Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir. And everyone should know that Mr. Ebert, me, Tim Allen, we're doing a scholarship for the Lacan class at Philosophy Portal. So everyone should show up and take that, because I was actually having a lovely conversation with Dimitri and Basecamp on the question of the relation of, say, we got into a bit on how psychoanalysis helps one makes choices that are their own grounding, which seems necessary today, say, on having children or kind of Nietzsche evaluation and different things. So we enjoyed that very much. But no, Mr. Trossi, I know you've spoken before about how during COVID, so many different teachers have left, the difficulty of the school system, how one goes about teaching. And I am very curious also with Mr. Jockin, on your experience on teaching and how you think about going about teaching schools and, like, students and the problems of education. Is education a lost cause? Well, there's a difference between schooling and education, obviously, but is school or the college system a lost cause? Is it not? How does one think about it today? I would just be curious to just throw that on the floor. It can go any direction whatsoever. What's something that one gains at college that they can't on these online spaces? What's the things that are learned in that environment that you can't do here, et cetera, so forth. So I'm curious about just the general experience of being a teacher or being a professor, and what that looks like today. Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir.
And great to see everybody. I mean, hey, John, great to meet you. Doing Lord's work, working at that educate. No, really. I mean, I got to be honest. I have a lot of my friends I grew up with. They became educators in the public school system. K through 12, around those different ranges. I'll be very blunt. The mechanism, basically, the scrutiny and the mechanization of education at the lower levels is really intense. That it's completely absent at the college level. Which is kind of a shame. It's almost like in the act of quantum. Let me put it this way, John. I mean, it's very typical. The metric of success for the work John is doing is by standardized tests. That is absolutely not even in the equation at the college level. That's not even a consideration of metrics at all. Whether that's good or bad, that's a separate discussion. But the reality is the quantification of education at the elementary, even high school level, it's just clearly obvious that's the case, and it's I almost feel like socially we've basically demanded educators to, it's bizarre. This isn't interesting. It's almost like we've relied on this kind of the rationalization of this space by quantification, thinking somehow that's going to make these students good, but it's only good under the quantification of SAT scores or standardized test scores. Not realizing, and I was to say, I mean, in general, your general question, Daniel, if you think education is just simply passing an exam of a test, that's a woefully flattened understanding of virtue, of excellence. It is what it is. It's just, I'm just being honest. Like, that's kind of the tension point. It's very hard to measure any moral goodness. If the liberal arts tradition, if it's meant to train you to be a morally good person, how would you even quantify? How would you even understand that? Obviously, that was the old mod trick, and that's much harder to do, let alone at the lower levels of education. Which, what I can say is coming into students not having any exposure to any of like classic literature or very minimal of it. It's kind of surprising how much. It wasn't like my education in a public school was that great, quite frankly. But like they didn't read any Shakespeare, for example, or some of these apparently are regional things. I came from New York down to the South to teach here, but yeah, I'm just kind of to answer your questions, Daniel. Lord's work, John, because I think those foundation training is super important, and also because that work is super demanding because there's an intensity of scrutiny and quantification. And ironically, it's both the massive demand of this profession to supposedly make these students, let me just be honest, economically viable, right? But yet also radical suspicion that they have no value. At the same time, it's like a double-edged sword of incredible suspicion, yet demand expectations at the same time. It's almost schizophrenic. It doesn't make any sense. I'll close with that.
But I wanted to know, Mr. Jackson, so there's a few things. First off, I've been reading a lot of Ivan Illich because we're doing stuff at Parallax. And something he talks about is the difference between the replacement of humanity and the extension of humanity. And so, for example, he says very often we tend to use technology to replace our humanity as opposed to extend our humanity. And in his book, Deschooling Education, he talks about basically, and I'll put it this way, Neil Postman in his book on Teaching a Subversive Act talks about how today we believe the educated person is good at trivia. You're asked a random question and you're able to answer it. Oh, you must be smart because the teacher has a random question. Where he says what that does is he's using kind of a McLuhan critique, where for McLuhan, the medium is the message. And he's saying the very medium of education suggests that an intelligent person is good at trivia, as opposed to actively thinking through problems that no one in the room knows the answer to, including the teacher. And so what that ends up doing is that for Ivan Illich, intelligence is replaced by trivia, because human intelligence is the ability to problem solve when nobody knows the answers, is something that he's emphasizing. So you have an education system that replaces the human as opposed to extend the human in the sense of being able to extend our humanity to be more human. And he goes on and on in Tools of Conveniality to say that's basically what the problem is like. If we're going to use artificial intelligence, how do we use it to say extend humanity as opposed to replace humanity? I know Mr. Ebert and I, we had that one net conversation talking about always using AI to think of new forms of human intelligence or art to get ahead. The escape artist, he had that talk at the Stoa as well. And that would be an example of thinking of AI to extend humanity, to push humanity, as opposed to, say, replace humanity. And so Mr. Illich, he'll use that also in thinking about health. How do we have health not be replaced by medicine? Not because medicine is bad, but there's a temptation to think that just taking medication means that you're healthy. How do you do that in education? How do you do that? We could also talk about in Heidegger, right, with Mr. Luber. How do you have a conversation of being that isn't replaced by beings? But the question I wanted to ask Mr. Jockin, so Mr. Jockin, I've been reading, The Republic, and I'm really curious what Plato and Socrates means by music, because he seems to start education with a sense of music in the book 7. And to me, music does not seem to be merely playing violin. It seems to be a sense of the music of the spheres. It seems to be like how everything goes together. He seems to associate it with logic and mathematics and kind of a sense that there's like something like a sense of the whole, really. Now, this might be entirely wrong, but I find it really interesting because if education starts with music, because I'll just speak to our own experience, there's a big difference with homeschooling when you start your kids with a sense of like what is a tree? Like getting them interested in things, that there's like a music, there's like a thing in the world that they're trying to tap into. They become intrinsically motivated. Now, I'm obsessed with intrinsic motivation. So I'm really curious, like how Socrates, Plato, and the Republic, because arguably the Republic is extremely concerned about education, starts with music. Gymnastics and music tend to go together. And it's very interesting to think that if you start education with a sense of the music of the cosmos, or the wholeness, or that there's a, dare I say, like meaning behind things, although meaning is a loaded term in today's context, that then intrinsically motivates the students. What's so interesting is he also seems to almost put study, art, well, I guess we would associate with traditional education much later in life, like at like years 10 after like play and gymnastics, because it's almost like the study of the trivia, if you will, can actually de-spirit, remove motivation to learn. And if you do it too early, you kill it. So I'm curious on what you think music means. And then I will also note lastly, and then give it to Mr. Jockin, when I talk about where we used to sword fight with PCP pipe and get bloodied in the eye, this Mr. Trossi is the one who can tell you all about that.
That's good to know. Daniel, I don't know if you've read Philebus, because, it's funny. Actually, I read mostly early Platonics. It's only recently I got introduced to late Platonic writing, and he goes systematic about this. It's funny. So my lecture series, The Beautiful and Virtue, everything's a preamble, setting it up. It's actually kind of conveniently nice that I chose not to talk about in this series, because all the setup answer questions in my lecture series are effectively answered in Philebus. And because the relation of measure, music, and beauty and harmony are all discussed there. Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, in literacy training, education for literacy, it was taught by music. In fact, there's really fascinating notes from music theorists about the relationship of music notation and writing as effectively the same. And generally, literature has been reviewed as shown that music training with music and rhythm basically increased memory retention, acquisition of literacy skills. So that question when you're getting at, Daniel, in terms of like making education more alive, more living through the introductions of music, it's totally true. And anyway, John would probably agree, like mnemonics, kind of using tricks of figure to create retention of memory, to remember things that are effectively accidental structures that allow more intelligibility. That's kind of the ultimately for I would make the argument from looking at Plato's writing. The beautiful is a kind of intelligibility. So it's like radically different from any preference judgment call per se. It's the kind of, the more beautiful something is, the more intelligible it is. And in fact, it's really fascinating because even the discussion of the correctness of names from Cratylus, the word used for correct naming when something's named well is cologne, beautiful, or fair. It gets interesting translations how that works, but it's constantly cologne. It's the word for beauty is used by Plato to say when something is correct or fitting. It's constantly being used in that mode. That's more of a tangent note, but to answer your main question, Daniel, the kind of idea of the beautiful as in music as the method of instruction, because it's basically geometry. Basically, if you had to basically summarize it, what's Plato's account? It's geometry, music. Those were basically and gymnastics. So these are the kind of intersections of the body, of the physical reality of the world with the more intelligible reality. They interrelate with each other. That would be, I think, a very fair understanding. And that, I think the applications of that in mnemonics or other methods of instruction and literacy, the Catholic Church when it was teaching literacy, would do it by the songs, right? Of the Ave Mary, for example, things like that. It was a common methodology because it helps with intelligibility. That's ultimately what it does. That gives things like chunking, for example. We have all these neurological explanations now, but the basic idea is it imposes more intelligibility onto things that are basically can fade out into literally trivia nothingness, right? Into basically the background noise of irrelevancy. So yeah, that's answered that question just right there, which I think it's a lost understanding. We don't really have that understanding at all.
Well, I really like that, and I'm gonna have to yell at Javier for not being here because he's been doing so much on like Socrates and forms and whatever. So I'm gonna have to yell at him. So there's a few things.
By the way, I'm actually with him doing those, and I'm in a reading group with him actually. So shout out to Javier.
Yo, Javier. So there's a few things that come to mind. First off, I remember vividly when Bernard Hankins and I was speaking, and he was mentioning the Linkin Park CD Reanimation, where they did the first album, they did like Symphony, and I could remember all the music. And isn't it funny how it's really easy to remember music, but like really hard to remember random information? So there's something there. And I also one time had to read a stupid amount of like really technical tax documents, and I, just for fun. Yeah. And I don't remember any of it. But I can't, it's funny how I can remember like Wallace Stevens or poets or different things. So it is curious if there's something about language that more approaches music that is then easier to remember and to recall and to integrate. And there's some ironies there, because that would suggest that then if education today has a trivia structure, which is then all about memorization, that very trivia structure makes us worse at the very memorization that education is focused on, which would be a lovely irony, and I'm obsessed with irony. It also would suggest then that there's quite a lot of problems with a culture that no longer, like when Trossi is visiting, we do a lot of jamming because it's a freaking lot of fun. He's really, really good on the guitar. And it's, you don't really have a culture anymore of people that in their free time play music. I wonder if that's detrimental to memory or sort of thinking in these tunes. I also, the last thing, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber. It's very interesting to me that if I'm jamming on the piano, the kids almost can't help but sway. They can't help but dance. There's something about music that when you hear it, you just find yourself tapping your foot. It pulls you in. I wonder if there's something about reading musical prose that can't help but pull you in and help you have your life changed by it, and help, like, is there something about when language is musical, or there's something about language that then pulls you in the same way that good music, you can't help but tap your foot, in the same way that when Mr. Ebert is doing truth or whistling, that I can't help but try to whistle as well, although I suck at whistling. Mr. Trossi's good at it. But let me give it to Luber and then Mr. Jock. And Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too. Good to see you too. Yeah, I think it's a good question to have, memory and its relation to being and beings. I think when you don't remember something, it's because what you're not remembering is in the realm of beings, insofar as there's a certain forgetting of its being, so to speak, and therefore, because there's that forgetting in its being, you can't have a distinct memory about it. So like with music, especially when it's a good song or a good tune, so to speak, every element, every feature of that song has being or theme present in that very feature. So like with story, when you don't forget a part of the story, in my mind, it's because the theme isn't present in that part of the story to a significant degree. So your memory becomes wonky on it. But the parts that are like super thematic, like for example, like with Oppenheimer, like the actual explosion and how there was a delay between the sight of the explosion and the actual noise of the explosion. Like, I feel as if you see that movie, you can't forget that part. It's like impossible to forget that part. And that you can't forget it because it's so thematic. That is literally what the story is about. That there's this giant chaotic explosion, but it looks beautiful. Like how you arrive there's a certain beauty to that arrival. But what is not seen in that dynamic is the catastrophe in that beautiful arrival, and that noise, that following up noise of that symbolizes that that horrible aspect of that beautiful discovery. And yeah, it's just having the dichotomies that I would like to think of it as like almost like a really wide spectrum of dichotomies being present in the actual feature of the content that is presented to you. And when you don't have that wide range of dichotomies, then you Sorry, I'm getting a call. I'm gonna call him back later. But yeah, when you don't have being present in the piece of content, then it's easy to forget. So when you're not playing music a lot, I think my friends that play music, they all play music a lot when they're sad or when they're in a certain type of intense emotion. Insofar as I think they play to feel a memory that isn't that negative emotion. So it's a way, it's like a therapeutic tool to recall a certain position in which you enjoy being in. Yeah, I think the forgetting of being has a direct correlation with memory. So yeah, that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Mr. Luber. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. And I, first off, Mr. Luber has been working very, very hard with Alex. We've had a lot of fun conversations about story theme. And so there's almost an association here of music and theme in some respects. And a few other things, if like memory is so big for Plato, then is memory like a recalling of the music, right? And there's a few more things. It almost seems easier to remember the theme song of Jaws than the scenes of Jaws, right? Like it's easy to forget things, but you can remember the themes. Now you could say, well, duh, Dan, because there's like less to remember with the theme, but I don't know. There's something that's like easier to recall. And then there's also parts where if I ask you to recall the note of C, that almost seems more difficult than recalling a song that's in C, right? Like notes are harder, but not these things that are part of something else. And then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Trossi. The other thing that's interesting is often when I try to remember something, I find myself going through the list of where I was, like going back, it's like, okay, no, I was reading this book and think, oh, that's right. Like you try to like go through a hole to arrive at the part you forgot. And it's interesting how like there's something about a referring or recalling a whole that helps you arrive. So then if we fragmented ideas from a whole, that may make them more difficult to recall or to integrate. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Trossi. Mr. Jockin.
Well, and by the way, like what you were saying before about music's role in society, I mean, the entire traditions, Gregorian chant, for example, Quranic recitation, these are all music, like musical structures that not only allow for memory and recalling, but literally organize and structure entire societies and how they orient themselves in the first place, and let alone structures that kind of build into it. A Gregorian chant is actually more powerful when it's in a cathedral that built on that, for example. The only thing I would challenge is, like, thing is intelligence and memory. I want to challenge that a little bit, only because I don't think that's necessarily what Plato would speak. I mean, the doctrine of recollection or recognizing or association. It's not necessarily a recalling, basically, of a duplication. It's not necessarily that. It could be, because you recollect, you recall, you can retell the event. But I think it might be more than that. I just bring it up also because, like, in music, the idea of motifs. So I find that very fascinating in music theory, the idea, like, if you have certain narrative structures, the motifs, so certain note constructions can depict a character in the scene of a music. It's very fun when you see that. Like even like the Bumblebee song, like an obnoxious one. It actually has a motif in it. There's a character in it who gets turned to the Bumblebee. That motif is in other parts of the play, of the composition, like in other songs. And it's actually in there in the Bumblebee ballad as well. It's just been transformed by a very rapid tempo increase to give a simulacrum of a beat, basically, the feeling of that. Yeah, so that was just, I think that's probably the motif here. Always what I'd like to bring up and talk about is like this use of music and the structures of it. I think actually one thing is what Andrew's saying too, by the way. What we're getting at here is, what do we mean by being in the first place? I know it's obnoxious. That's an incredibly obnoxious question to ask. But I'm just bringing it up because normally a lot of times people would just say that's existence. So like physical entities is being. But everything we're talking about here is at the minimum very radically different kinds of existences. Frequencies of sound correlating to a goddamn shark, as an example. These things are not the same in any way. So what I'm also kind of getting at is being would probably, I mean, this is a very classical point of view. It's just, you seem to forget this, it's figure and form, but then of course the real question is that a lot of times the question is that more being the actual physical existence? I think the classical view would be is yes, it is. It's more being. But it's a great mystery for us. I just want to throw that on the table because like Andrew's points about forgetfulness of being, it's kind of what he's getting at here, at least my reading of what he's saying here. About that, especially on this, what I'm saying here, using motifs and music and other things that help you with recollection or recognizing things that are forgotten, basically. And I'll stop with that.
That's lovely. I'll give it to Mr. Trossi and a few things. Mr. Luber, as a good Heideggerian, is bringing forth terms of being and recalling being and clearing and so on and so forth. But it's very interesting. I on the point, though, what Plato and Meno and what Augustine mean by memory, one of the things that they're doing is actually trying to show that memory is not mere recalling, like a one-to-one. Because Augustine is like, well, wait a minute, when I remember something, I don't actually go to the past and it's always filtered, right? It's like memory is not merely recalling. There's some sort of way in which bringing into the present changes the quality of the present. And that there's something that's actually occurring there that is trying to recapture something that is needed for the present to even be present. That if I don't recall, I lose something. And maybe a way to think about this, and I'll give it to Mr. Trossi, thinking about now is if you watch Home Alone and you mute it without any music, it kind of sucks. And you turn on the music and the movie is an entirely different experience, right? And even silent films had music. So maybe there's something here where music to movies is what memory is to life. And where music kind of creates the sort of structure and the action and the sort of compelling, there's a certain sort of quality of the experience that a movie has when it has music that's very different if it was just muted or you just had the sound effects without the music. I'm not saying that can't work at all in an artistic creation, but in the same way that like the present, like if I couldn't remember anything in this room, then it would have an entirely different relation to me than me knowing it's my grandparents' old house or something, right? Like I recall that and it actually has a different quality to it. It's like the music of being in the room, of the story, of the life that's coming to be. That is thanks to the recalling, but it's not merely bringing a fact to acknowledge a fact. It's bringing information to the past to now to change the quality of the meaning of where I am, to where it, then I recall how it's changed, then I recall the roots to it. So it is very interesting to think of what exactly is going on with memory. And if it has something maybe just to play on this kind of, and then of course, if recalling being is how in a Heideggerian sense, you don't lose being, like beings have a tendency to forget being. And so then they don't have a music or a theme by which to bring them together or to make them intelligible in a manner that doesn't lead to their ultimate self-effacement. Then maybe there's also something where a movie that doesn't have music sucks, in the same way that beings that forget being sucks, in the same way that life, if you're not able to connect it with memories or be able to think it together, loses some sort of storied element there. I'm not sure, but I will pass it to Mr. John Trossi. Mr. John Trossi, again, I'm sorry that time I hit you in the face with the pole and you were bleeding everywhere, but then I got hit in the face. It was all even in the end.
That's what we do it for, If you're not bleeding, you're not living. That's what I always say. So, what you say there is really interesting about, I wrote, music or that film had music before it had dialogue, right? When you go back into the early 1900s, when people were making actual somewhat of films, you were mostly see those silent films. There was the written text up on the screen and all, but the priority or the audio that you were receiving was the music behind it, and the music was always connected, I think, to like Looney Tunes. I loved Looney Tunes when I was a kid, the old ones from the 50s, 60s, 70s, because it was so orchestral, and every movement, every aspect had a motif. Every moment had an emotion tied to it, and it really tied together, even if there was no dialogue, which was often common with something like, Wile E. Coyote, or, you'd get the Bugs Bunny cartoons and Elmer Fudd with their little quips back and forth and things like that. But the most memorable ones I have is like Bugs Bunny coming down from Valhalla with the Valkyries and all like that, or that kind of thing comes to mind. And also in terms of music, and as an educator, I did take a class in college about integrating arts, and that was required. And there's a reason it's required. It's because the arts engage the multiple senses. And when you can engage multiple senses at one time, you can connect more deeply. And when you can connect more deeply, not only do you have that retention, but you're inspired to create your own rendition or your own variation that derives from what you received, rather than taking in, putting out, which is what we see with a lot of standardized testing, which ironically is not for the students, it's for this guy, and it's not even really for me, it's for the guy on the hill that gets paid more than me. But back to the music, you know, I think about the making those deeper connections. Somebody had mentioned the chunking, and I think about the different movements throughout orchestral music and more complex music than what we hear on the radio and things like that, where you have this overall motif where you start with the A section, then you move to the B section, maybe you move back to the A, or maybe you go on to a C, but they're all interconnected, even though they're providing something different. And that depth is what is allowing people to be in that problem-solving mindset further down the road, that creative mindset down the road. That I think the trivial nature that you mentioned really disguises the importance of that complexity. I think about the nature of pop music and how formulaic it is, and how every song sounds almost exactly the same, and people are made to feel all of these things related to the lyrics, but they're all saying the same thing. And that's why it's so successful, is because it can relate to so many different people in a very simple way. And that's all well and good for that. But for me, I think you don't necessarily need music theory to appreciate, and it's not about music theory that allows one to appreciate the more complex music, the orchestral, even, you know, I like to listen to a lot of metal because it's got a lot of that same complexity to it, and it's not the same sort of thing over and over and over again. I think of musicals, you know, they're telling a story and they're using this motif that they keep coming back to, and that's my favorite thing about complex music, is that coming back. You're grounded in this foundation. You go to all of these different places, but you're still rooted at where you began. And it's interesting to that effect, because you think of music and songs as organized vibrations. One could argue that we are organized vibrations down to the atomic level, all the way up, of vibrating electrons and everything bouncing against each other. And when we can resonate with the music that we're listening to, we can resonate with the story being told, we can resonate with the lesson being taught, we can then have it be a part of us, and then put it out into the world as something completely new, completely unique, and to ideally the value of everybody else, rather than slowly dwindling the masses down with trivial knowledge of what did the latest pop star do, rather than how is the latest pop star's song. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Trossi. I'll give it to Mr. Luber, then Mr. Alex Ebert. And it's funny, you mentioned the Looney Tune Valhalla, and I'm instantly taken to Bugs Bunny and the yellow hair. And it's funny how you recall that. I'm really taken also by the notion of this coming back. This coming back in the thematic, the Wagner sort of sense, seems to have something more to do with this recalling Plato, Augustine, and then Bergson with intuition in his book Memory and Matter. And there's something about the intellectual act that is this necessity of thinking in a manner that is recalling back to, that then makes the present. And if we don't do that, well, and then the last thing I'll say, and then give it to Mr. Luba, I've been reading a lot on William Ong, who talks about the tradition from oral speaking to written word. And one of the things he says is that when you speak, words and ideas kind of have a music to them, actually. Like I speak to you and there's a kind of sound, there's a kind of rhythm. And he said, but when you go to the written word, you can lose that. And one of the things, he argues that not merely is it an information change when you go from from spoken to written, but the way humans think changes as well. And basically what he's warning, and Ivan Illich as well, is that the music of speech is not present when you write in the same way. So we must be conscious of that. And somehow either learn, like you could say poetry restores it, but a different way to approach the written word, so you regain that music. Because if you lose that, what Mr. Ongen then warns is that's a tendency toward fragmentation or abstraction and the loss of embodiment in a manner that could have problems. Now, William Ong also argues that before the written word, the scientific treatise was impossible. Now, I would have to elaborate on that. So he's not saying this is a bad thing, but he's saying that we have to be aware that when you speak, he also points out, I thought it was quite interesting, he's like, it's much more easy to understand why they thought of some words as feminine and masculine, like you go into the Latin and different things when it was the voice, because you could actually hear kind of difference. But when it's written, it's a little more difficult to understand why they had that. Now, that's another thing he elaborates on, but it's pretty interesting. So that would also sort of suggest that the movement from the oral to the written means that the work of the kind of vibration and the resonance is not as easily present in information and somehow has to be made up for. What exactly that looks like, how one goes about that, those are different questions. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Ebert. And Mr. Ebert also had some lovely things when he talks about the defense of suboptimal, so that we avoid the kind of the blueprint, blueprint or the TV effect that's all the music is the same, because that's what's optimized. So it makes me think a bit what you were saying of what Mr. Ebert has done. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Ebert. Mr. Luber.
It's funny to think. I wonder what woke people would say about that notion of back when in those Latin days, you could hear the difference. You can hear how something is feminine. You can hear like it's a natural phenomena. I mean, maybe they might say that it's part of the cultural script that they were under, but yeah, that's very interesting. I'll have to check them out. And then John, with what you were saying with the vibration stuff, it just reminds me of Michael Levin and how he talks about cognition and how cognition is just all the way down to the bioelectrical realm and all the way up to the corporeal realm, so to speak. And that it's scale free, as he would put it. But I would have to, I guess, elaborate on that. And I'm not nowhere near an expert on what he talks about, but it sounds interesting when he talks. Yeah, the notion of music and movies and memory and life, I think, is a really nice notion. I personally believe that we're living in this like era, this epoch that will be forgotten, because this lack of, like what Jockin was saying, how being, I would say being is the forms, but they're the forms in an active sense. They're actively present, giving rise to the particulars, so to speak. But yeah, the lack of these forms in like our present landscape, I feel like is very present when I don't even remember like 3 years ago what kind of phone I had. Like, I don't know if it was like the iPhone 6 or 7. Like, I'm just thinking like when I am 80 years old and my grandkids say, hey, when you were younger, like what cell phone did you have? Like, what exact cell phone did you have? There's so many iPhones now that I would just be saying it was the iPhone. Which iPhone though? Like, was it the 10 or the 15 that's going to be coming out? I can't imagine that I'm going to remember the exact, tools, so to speak, technological tools that I was using. So it just seems that like a lot of what I focus on in my life, like the medians in which I focus my life through, I feel like I'm not going to remember them, and ergo, there's a dimension of my life, because I'm using these medians to, in a sense, have access to my own life. I'm using these medians that are going to be forgotten. So I feel like a dimension of my life will be forgotten. And that might sound really depressing, but I do find it true when it's like, I was thinking the other day, I don't even know what it's called. Maybe because I'm just 27 and young, but like, I just remember there was a time in elementary school, they were using this device where they would put like some like translucent screen on the some like projector thing, and it would project on, and they can like write on the translucent screen. I don't even know what it's called, but then it got moved to these giant like smart boards where it was like a giant like computer board where they take like a marker of sorts and write on the board. I don't even remember that transition. Like I remember at one point it was that, and then oh, there's these giant boards on the wall. Like it just seems that humans are forgetting the story in which they're living in, and in a certain sense, because they're forgetting huge aspects of the story, the medians in which their story is being understood, they're going to forget then aspects of their life, where their memory will be distorted in a way because they don't understand, you know, I'm being crude here, when I had the iPhone 6 versus the iPhone 15, whatever. But yeah, I just and then one more thing, I remember seeing like on TikTok, like it was back when like Kanye and Kim Kardashian were together, and they're like living in the house, and their house was like just a giant white walls with like nothing but white, and like not cement but ceramic like tables and stuff that were just white. And I'm just thinking to myself, it's like so primal in a sense, because it's like very simplistic, but there's nothing that I can imagine their person being attached to it. It's like their children are growing up in an environment like Dan, you're saying like you're in your grandparents' living room. Like there's a whole like orientation right there with that phrase that you have when you walk into that room. I feel like it's so hard in the way modern aesthetics are presented to have that type of historicity, that orientation toward the aesthetics that are present. So that's just like a comment I wanted to say, to just piggyback off of this whole notion that we're living in the forgetful era of the human race. But yeah.
No, that's lovely. And Chetan, good to see you.
Sharp haircut, my friend. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. So I now have, first off, I'll be able to recall that I had flip phone 1 and then flip phone 2. So I'll recall that. And now I'm thinking about, do we need to be more intentional about integrating music into our lives so that we remember things and therefore have more of a story versus fragments? And then, of course, what is music? I can also think about how I remember so well the jam sessions with John Trossi, or the like I remember the poetry of Bernard Hankins or Latasha that was spoken word, or say some other poetry, how there's something about music that if you integrate music into your life, you also, when you do music with friends, you then know that that kind of interaction with friends is possible, of that kind of flow. And you remember that, and that then changes the quality of what you may do with friends now. So it's interesting to think of using music not to forget things, perhaps, and then maybe a broader sense of music like we were talking about earlier. But let me give it to Mr. Alexander Ebert. Mr. Ebert, good to see you today, sir. I hope you're well. And everyone, we have the scholarship thing for Lacan class, so everyone join the scholarship, et cetera, so forth and so on. Mr. Ebert.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about music. I'm scoring a movie right now, just taking a break from that. So, and it's interesting when you're scoring a movie, you can turn it into a comedy, you can turn it into a thriller, you can turn it into any movie you want to, because music encapsulates tone. It delimits and demarcates the space of narrative. It almost, you know, it's like when you tell a story and you don't have music, you suddenly become very aware that you need to set the tone. And suddenly you start talking in one way or the other way. If it's a scary story, you say it was a dark and scary night. And you start talking musically in that tone, because you wouldn't have to do that if you had Halloween music playing, right? You need something to set the tone and to encapsulate the narrative context. And music cinematizes, and I think in a lot of ways what that's actually doing, although you know we have trouble with the language of limit, is it's limiting the scope of experience so that that scope can be saturated with a specific kind of tone. You know, you go to see a thriller knowing the category and then wanting that category to saturate itself to the point of being thrilled, and a certain sort of, parietal lobe shutdown and loss of self, and you're enthralled and engrossed, and all of these things which, the whole premise of the cinema is that you forget that you're watching the cinema, and the whole art of editing is that you edit such that you never draw the viewer's attention to the fact that they're watching a film, unless you want to do that intentionally. The whole idea is to sweep you into a reality, and the only way to really accomplish that is to saturate the limitations of the encapsulated narrative context. And I think that that's what movies do. In terms of memory, I still don't know what memory is. Most people don't really know what memory is. I'd say nobody actually really knows what memory is, or how it works, at least. We could have good theories on what it is. Whether or not, for instance, a memory, in order to sustain itself, is in constant repetition, such that it is always in surplus of its initial moment, that it is in such surplus that it goes absent within its own excess, and that's, there's something about memory that is not constant, that is not static, because every time we recall a memory, I don't know if you have any friends like this, but I have friends where each time they tell the story about me, their story changes and it becomes more and more, I don't know, hyperbolic or different or something. And somehow the memory they're recalling has changed over time, which indicates something more than simple retrieval. It indicates that something about the retrieval process has been molested by something. And what that something is that has molested the memory could be something in the mechanics of retrieval, but it could also be something in the memory itself, as the memory is subsisting and persisting through time in repeating itself. It sort of gains that pure difference of, time. It just keeps repeating, and it's a simulacrum of a simulacrum, but it is changing. And in some ways it's, for instance, Christian, my friend, always tells these stories about me, and they keep getting more and more hyperbolic, but really what they're also getting is more and more cartoonish. And by cartoonish, I mean further and further distilled from the sort of haphazard nuance of reality into the essential features of the narrative. The essential core cinematic features of the memory are all that remain. And then those features get embellished in whichever way. But somehow over time, like a grain of sand being polished down to its essential core features, the memory gets more and more potent in a way. Or ironically, you can end up polishing it down to the point where it literally disappears. You're like, shit, I forget that memory. I don't even remember what it was. But it was something. Anyway, yeah, cheers.
Lovely, Mr. Ebert. I'll give it to John Trossi and then Chetan. A few things. I really am taken by this idea of setting the tone and also the choice to score the music. You can make it a comedy, you can make it action, and so on and so forth. That's very interesting. Or you can make no music and then make it weird, right? You get a filming like you're just kind of in the audience waiting for the music, right? And it's almost like, based on this Plato, Socrates starting with music, it's almost like without music, education doesn't set the tone of what it is doing. And without that tone being set, then you don't oh, I'm not learning about it sets the tone of learning for the sake of figuring out how these things go together, how there's a kind of logic, how there's something deeper going on that you're always trying to work through. And it's interesting to think that without music, you don't set the tone of your friendships, you don't set the tone of your life, you don't set the tone of things. And then it's just, you're kind of at them. And basically to the point, like William Ong is kind of warning, he's like, hey, when you spoke words, the tone of the words per se was set. And so it was easier for people to situate them in their lives or in their community. But when it's written, it's not so set. And therefore, there's extra work that has to be done that you may not think you have to do. And maybe as a Heideggerian allusion from Mr. Luber, there's something that beings can't set the tone of themselves without being, with a capital B, if you grant that. And so regaining being is about setting the tone of life. And then the last thing, I think a lot of work needs to be done on the phenomenology of memory. It's very, very interesting because looking at like Augustine at the end of the Confessions, there's this idea that the only place to find God for him is in memory, because memory entails what is left in memory is essence, not accidents. Like that is where you find essence. And Bergson even seems to almost suggest that. Then memory is kind of the filtration system to get to the essence of things. And so it's not merely the bringing back, but a kind of filtering down in a way. And so, and it's very curious when you look at Augustine or then Bergson, how memory is very different from just this mere bringing back something. So I think those comments were lovely. I'll give it to Mr. Trossi. Mr. Trossi, then Chetan, and then Mr. Jock. And Mr. Trossi, please.
I'll try not to take too much time, but I'm just thinking about how when you set a tone, you can set a tone by not setting a tone. And that tone is very muted. It's very gray and uninteresting. And that's why so many children lose interest in school, because even though the walls are painted all kinds of beautiful colors, the tone of the teacher is very bland. It's very gray. You think about reading a textbook versus reading a children's book. There's no reason you can't read a textbook or read a PowerPoint or what have you in that same manner that gets the child excited, that gets the student excited. I teach in a very animated way that gets the kids engaged. I'm throwing myself around the room. I'm yelling because it's cool. It's interesting. Look at this. It works every single time, you know, especially with math. It's very cool in that way. And we're by setting that tone, we're teaching for the sake of learning rather than teaching to a test, which is a big battle that I've had to fight over the years as a teacher of, I don't care how they do on the test. I care whether or not they're interested so that they can continue their learning journey, that they can continue to want to be here and not see this as a prison, but as a place where so many profound things can be evoked, can be derived from for their own future and for the future of others. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Mr. Trossi, the idea that the role of the teacher should be to convince the students they're not in a prison, I think that should be like the phrase of the teaching association. And I would love to be in your classroom because that's beautiful. And yeah, it's like what I get from what I'm so curious about this idea of music starting education is basically the notion of they're not going to be interested in education if you don't start with a sense of the music. The sense of the music then makes them care about these different things. And then care is, of course, a Heideggerian term. And so I think it's very, very important, like you're saying, to figure out ways to make them care. Isn't this cool, et cetera, so forth. So I love that very much, Mr. Trossi. Let me give it to Chetan and then Mr. Thomas Jock. And Mr. Chetan, I hope you're feeling better. I know you were ill. I hope you are feeling better, sir.
I'm a little weak. I had a sort of long day. I attended a really bad sort of a conference, which is the authors meet. We're publishing in a book. You collected all the authors in one room and you asked them to discuss. And you don't know each other. You don't know what to say to them. You know, one of those awkward. Yeah. Very interesting discussions going on. I would rather be here than there, actually. So, you know, about this question of music and memory, actually, this is something I've been thinking about. I remember one of my favorite sort of fiction novelists called Doris Lessing asked this question once. Do we ever think that music actually sort of modern technologies was something which was only used for specific occasions and events? Now that you've given it sort of in an everyday sense to anybody who owns a phone in that sense, do we even understand what effect it would be having on people? It wasn't ever something which was supposed to be used in a way in which we are using it today. It's for the first time human species have been exposed to music in this manner. And it's not a small thing. We don't even understand the magnitude of what that means. Music was something always very sacred, always tuned for. So, for instance, in Indian classical music, we have a different sort of rhythms for morning, evening, night. We have different what you call ragas. We had different ragas for different occasions, different festivals. It wasn't something which you could do indiscriminately. It wasn't something like I could just get up, go and put in my iPad and play anything on it. There's something about doing that which we do not understand in that sense about. And I think that's the first thing that sort of puts you to think about music seriously. Second thing is that if you think about this question of what is music, where does it come from? And almost all questions of human subjectivity takes us back to some question of reason, some way of reason and language. We don't associate this relationship in music and language. We don't ask that question seriously. And if we do, we get very reductive answers. I remember reading a book by, not actually reading the whole book, but I just flipping through it, and it was such a badly done book. Somebody wrote a book based on Chomsky and grammar and music, and it turned out to be something very reductive and badly done thing. But these days I'm reading a lot of Lacan. And one of the things, so I had read the Pologne letter long back, before I had read Hegel and stuff. And now I'm reading it again, and something very radical is sort of coming to me after that journey that Lacan has a very interesting idea that it is in the movement of the letter or the movement of the unconscious that the letter hides itself. The Pologne letter, the unconscious remains on the surface but remains hidden in plain sight because it can move. That is how it's not hidden in depth. And if we think about it, it is through that movement that Lacan is sort of taking out an odd and even game, and we can get into those technicalities some other time. But it is in that movement that somewhere you will find the essence of music. Music actually, in many ways, emerges from that movement that holds the unconscious on the surface. That holds that creates signifying chain. Which is why music and which is why Lacan talks about memory within that sense of movement, because it is through that movement the unconscious remembers. If you remember, Freud had a very famous sort of point to it that in psychoanalytic sessions he doesn't want to remember things that his unconscious doesn't remember. So he says that if I have to remember something, my unconscious will remember it automatically. I don't write any notes. So if I just hear somebody and next time when the session comes, I'm not anxious about whether I will remember everything. If something is important enough, my unconscious will remember it. What does he mean by it? And I suspect that there is some close relationship between what Freud is saying there with rhythm. There is something about rhythm that emerges through which he's making a claim about this problem of unconscious memory. I'm not going to too much. It will be too long at this point, but there's something happening there. So memory as something which we consciously remember something. That is one kind of a problem. Memory as something which functions with the unconscious. As I said, the movement of the letter, movement of the signifying chain, the movement of the gap in the signifying chain is of a completely different order. And once you put in that context of the memory, it automatically links with music. It links with rhythm in some ways. What is that link about? I'm just opening that question out. And I'm not sure how everybody would, think through it, but yeah.
That's a lovely comment, and I'll give it to Mr. Jock and then Mr. Luber. And I think about often on the idea that there were people like who may have heard Beethoven's Ninth when it first came out once in their life and never again. And what kind of experience of music did people have then? It's like Walker Percy saying, imagine coming upon the Grand Canyon and not knowing it existed and not having a term. That experience is qualitatively different than someone who has a preset complex ahead of time. And then I'm also with the movement comment thinking about emphasis on causes and movement and like in Aristotle and Plato, and how like there's something about music, like you say, that it works by making each note in a way invisible, like the working doorknob in Heidegger, that's what makes music comes out. And the last thing, and then I'll give it Mr. Jockin, is I used to be kind of obsessive and like writing down everything. And then there was a point where you say, well, if it's really important, I'll remember it. Like, otherwise I'm just trying to write everything down. And it's funny how when you write everything down, it kind of gets fragmented. Whereas if you kind of trust that the things you're going to recall later in the day, and then maybe later in the day you write it down, like if you're just walking, then that's kind of more evidence that it's probably relevant or it's part of what you're working on or something. So there's something about a kind of music or movement in the subconscious mind that's very interesting there. So that's very nice, Chetan. I will give it to Mr. Jockin. And we love you. Yes, please. And we love you being here too instead of the conference. So thank you for that. And Chetan.
Just one more thing about this question of the noise lessons comment. Just 10 seconds in that if you think about it, music has also been used to induce certain thought patterns in people for a long time.
Yeah.
One should not forget that within that context. And once you are, sort of completely delinking music from that, today also, if you want to get into a space where you have to create certain group dynamics, music is an extremely important part of it. Anybody who wants to manipulate somebody else knows that. Rhythms are extremely important in any form of manipulation, especially groupthink. And yeah.
I think that's a lovely comment, that music can be used for mass movements for good and for bad, and to convince the children they need to go to bed quickly or else. You turn on that song and they know they need to run. So there's different associations with it. But let me give to Mr. Jockin, Mr. Lubin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, what John was just kind of piggybacking what John was demonstrating. I would say educators in general, they're rhetoricians. This is the Phaedrus model of it. Our job is ultimately to basically present by persuasion, moving subjects and pupils to different higher levels of intelligibility. What I mean by that too is, this is always an interesting question about where's rhetoric's place in Platonic argumentation or presentation. There are times where it seems like he's very much against it. There's times where he's very much for it. Phaedrus is his most optimistic view. And I think actually the applicability in education, John would probably agree, the way you would teach science concepts, models to a 5-year-old is different from a 10-year-old, and that's different from someone in college. You're going to use the basic kernel of truth will be the same, but the model will be obviously much more of a caricature. There will be inherently some untruths or oversimplicity presented in the figure to certain populations, right, certain groups, that you shift the form, the model presented to be intelligible to basically who you're presenting, let alone things like room. In the lingo, it's called classroom management. The less cringy form is presence in the room. The idea of basically commanding the room, right? So a good rhetorician does exactly the same thing. They command the room, changing vocalization, intonation, volume, right? Pausing, focusing, all these different. They're all the ways of communicating that are just as important as the content itself. So notice even the shifting of the content based on who you're talking to, and then even the mode of presentation is very much, these are the acts of a rhetorician. Plato makes the account of this very explicit in Phaedrus, and what John's discussion or demonstration was talking through, like raising your voice. That's a very obvious one. That's not. I have to say that's not very common, actually. I actually think a lot of, I'll tell you at the college level, I mean, a lot of times the professors think their job is to do research, not train the students. Obviously, it gets a little more, even in the arts, actually, because I come from the fine art tradition. I'm in the fine arts department. I don't get the sense from my colleagues that our job is to train these students. It's kind of more like a secondary accidental thing that, we happen to be here, and these students they can take it or leave it if they get anything out of this. I just find that generally the case. When I would hope ideally, also that education is not necessarily what you say, it's literally what you are. Exemplars, paradigms. Then the most powerful persuasion, and this is true in parenting, I think it's true in education in general, is when you are the embodiment of what you're trying to teach. So it's not this divorce of, here's this content from a textbook, here it is, I'm completely divorced from it. I mean, this is very, I got to be honest. I know that's actually super old school and not general. People don't buy into that. They don't think, like, what do you mean? You have to actually live by the things you teach. That seems to be a very divorced concept in general. Whenever I talk about it to people, they in my field, they generally go, what? What do you mean? Like, in most basic point, if you assign your students the assignment, the instructor should do the assignment too. And by that demonstration, you're actually creating a principle, a reference measure, basically that to judge the other students, right? And to give a reference point for the students to see what's possible. I mean, ultimately what exemplars are. I mean, in its worst case scenario, it's a duplication. That's not a good sign. But ideally, like every exemplar, is meant to motivate what's possible, that I can do this too. And I can do more, ideally. So just John's getting commentary and discussions. I'm reminded of a lot of the rhetorician discussed, which is the doctor of the soul, by the way. I mean, Plato has this, like, the most esteemed position. The only other time I've ever heard that statement, the doctor of the soul, that's some good old-fashioned Aquinas or Augustine right there. That's some good priests are said to be the doctors of the soul. So that's a super high level to have Plato assumed for the rhetorician right there. You know, Chetan's comments are right about, I don't know, it is very true. Like the idea that music used to not be a very private affair. It's very true. It is very private. I mean, since the advent of the Walkman, the idea that you can literally, through all common spaces in any urban center, you can just put on your headphones, a la Walkman or iPods now, and block out all other interactions in the common spaces at all. And it's kind of meant to be kind of a numbing, basically, I think Chetan's absolutely correct. He didn't say, Chetan can fill up this point, but it definitely feels like it's in the same category of a numbing soma kind of property, where it's meant to just medicate and numb out the ugliness of modern society. You don't have to deal with a homeless person begging you for money. Or like have any sense of kind of, again, being effaced by the radical alienation that you have no association to these strangers in the subway car with you, for example. Or that you're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic for an hour and a half, isolated in your little tin box car, as an example. So I think that's actually a very fair point. As I said before, you know, music was always a social organizing principle. I mean, Daniel said it before. You play a song, your kids can't help themselves. They're literally getting synchronized to the music, let alone things like a Gregorian chant or Quranic citation. These are all activities of music or musicalness that are coordinating and organizing people to associate in a common kind of environment. So I think these are really good points by Chetan on that. The big question I really have is ultimately, it's fascinating because music, isn't it interesting? Music is something that you have to experience in time, but yet there's a kind of essence that you can grab at. Jaws theme. Like I say it, and you know, if you have an understanding of it, you know what I'm getting at. There's nothing interesting about that. So I think I'm hemming and hawing about that point. Two other notes, by the way, Andrew, your question about, you know, we were talking in the chat about silence. I just read a paper about human beings are able to, it's the paper that demonstrated that we're able to perceive different kinds of silences, which is fascinating. So it basically means that the kind of intelligibility of silence and different kinds of silences. So it's actually not non-being, at least not the normal way. The lack is not nothing argument has been presented again, which is always fun. That's one of my side projects I always love talking about. Daniel, your question about, you brought up Meno. I'm just going to say it. You know, Plato's argumentation, if you notice, it's not theological. It's never like, there are some moments he just pulls out of his ass. He just pulls out like, oh, God gave us this divine inspiration. Bop. At certain points in some of his dialogues, that is not his common move of justification. Well, the argument, for example, in Meno, the demonstration with the slave boy is a proof of the immortality of the soul. It's also in Phaedra, for example. So that's actually a really interesting point, that memory is a demonstration or recollection, the way because I know what we mean. I know now what you mean, Daniel, by saying memory. We mean the argument of recollection. It's got to come from somewhere. Thus, the argumentation is thus there must be an immortal soul that already knows all or had access to all that you can draw out again. So I just want to point that out. That's actually even more for spicy take. I just want to point that out. That's something very extreme being stated there. And actually Plato relies on a lot, almost all. I would make the argument that instead of a theological justification, it's an immortality of the soul argument. That's the bedrock of Plato's argumentation in almost all of his dialogues at the end when you look at it all. That's all I got to say.
You said a lot of really good stuff. I'm going to give it to Luba,
Trossi, and then Chetan. First off, you mentioned the Jaws theme. It's very interesting. You recall the song, and it's suddenly like it unpacks the entire movie, almost like a zip file. Well, likewise, Plato and Augustine are like, hey, man, it's almost like memory is unpacking like all of reality, or like the immortality. It's almost like the act of memory suggests that there's an entire immortality that can be unpacked from that that you're pointing at. In Bergson, the way I think about it is Bergson talks about holograms. A hologram is where one piece of information contains the whole. If you have a part, you also have the whole in a hologram. So likewise, a memory, like when Augustine's going through it, he's like, dude, if you look at this memory real close, it seems like you can unpack it into an entire picture that suggests a certain immortality, or we're able to recall Eden. I mean, there's a lot in the phenomenology of memory that's going on in those classical thinkers that we don't entirely appreciate. So I think it's very rich on what you're getting at. Like, is a memory a zip file that if you unpack it, it brings with it an entire, dare I say, being, if we want to use a Heideggerian term, because like that's what they're basically like Bergson's crazy, man. Like, there's a lot more going on in Bergson than, I mean, he's crazy. But anyway, I just want to say, I'm really taken also by this notion of teaching as persuasion. I think we try to persuade with force. We say, if you don't learn this, you'll fail a test. And it's interesting to think about rhetoric as persuasion and the job of teaching as persuasion. And then it's almost like if we go back to music being like music for Plato, if you start with music with the student, that persuades them into thinking what they learn matters. Hey, look, there is an intelligibility to reality. Let me go give it to Mr. Trossi, though, because I know you have to go in a minute. Trossi, you're a beautiful soul. I love you. Thank you for being here, sir. Let me give it to Trossi really quick.
It's kind of you to give me a little bump in the queue there. I just was thinking back to kind of where we started, and well, I was thinking about what somebody was saying earlier about rhythm and such, and rhythm and patterns can kind of relate back to our sense of comfort that is derived from familiarity, and that then allows us to, as students, or allow us as a teacher to install in our students or impart in our students whatever it is that we are trying to impart. There is a very strong argument of, you know, the student can't learn if they're not comfortable, if they are in their downstairs brain, as they call it, in the more kind of primal side of our brain. We cannot connect to that frontal cortex, that frontal lobe, where the memories would then be kind of being built through whatever the lesson is. You think of a kid that's really angry, they're not able to pay attention to what you're talking about because they are in defense mode. They need to be in that area of comfort in order to have that imparted, in order to retain that information that would then later be able to be used for more applicable reasons. I was also thinking about this idea of scaffolding, which is another big thing with education, you know, even just within a single lesson or a single unit. In particular, I think about it with math or with literacy, where you have to learn addition before you can learn multiplication. And that's a simplified version of the concept, but I'm thinking about music as a long drawn out thing, long-term learning being the crescendo that comes from the scaffolding over many years, but that crescendo doesn't mean anything or can't even necessarily happen without that build-up, and that build-up can't happen, or it doesn't have meaning to it if it's not rooted in something that's engaging, something that can be referenced again and again in that same sort of rhythmic, pattern-oriented mindset that's needed in order to make something meaningful with it.
That's a beautiful comment, Mr. Trossi, and thank you for being here today, sir. I look forward when you have to go. I look forward to our next sword fight. And again, everything that you're saying makes me think of music in Plato. Like, you start without that, you don't have the scaffolding, so you can't recall anything. And I think we forget that education, it's not merely learning. You also have to have the ability to recall what you learn. And like, if you read a book but can't remember any of it, I'm not saying that there's no value in it, but, you know, recalling is different from learning, right? But this is what's interesting for a lot of these classical thinkers. The act of recalling derives essence. Like, there's an essence that comes out, but it's interesting to think that recalling is enhanced by music. And so music becomes the logic of essence in some way, or the means of pulling out essence and deriving different things. So the comment that you're making is very well. And yet today we tried to persuade that this is important through threat. You know, you're going to fail the test, you're not going to have a good job, as opposed to introducing to a music that makes you want. So likewise, another way to think of it is like wisdom. Like, when I sat on the porch and listened to the stories of old of these people interested in life, like, wisdom persuaded me that learning mattered. Therefore, you are intrinsically motivated to do it. And by music, it seems to be about music and logic of the cosmos, or the world has intelligibility. And isn't that wonderful? There's wonder that you can learn if you just learn these things. And Javier is here now, so we're going to harass him on Socrates. But there's like this music to things. So I think it's just wonderful. But Mr. Trossi, you're beautiful. So I'll give it to Mr. Luber, and then Chetan, and then Javier Rivera. Good to see you, my friend. Trossi, you're beautiful. Mr. Luber, please.
I have so much to say. Okay. So I guess I'll just start with like my original comment and just kind of go off from there. But memory is the limit in which presence contorts itself as presence or present, whatever. What I mean by that is, like, to answer Daniel's question as being as a giant like zip file that just opens, the answer is yes. And basically what I mean by it's the memory is the limit in which presence contorts itself as presence. The act of contortion, if that's a word, is basically just carrying through. It's holding the essence of presence in the current present moment. So when you say Jaws theme song, for example, it's holding the essence of a presence, to call that presence Jaws, or the presence of the horrifying feeling of an external force that's attacking you, that's an overpowering attack. It's capturing a certain presence that any which thing that is presence probably has some orientation toward that. Like, to be funny, I guess, if you could imagine being a flower and someone's about to pluck you, that would be like equivalent to Jaws about to eat you. Like, it's like fine on its own, it's beautiful, but I want to give this flower to my wife, so I'm going to pluck you, sir, or whatever you are. And just that act of plucking, that you could apply that Jaws theme song to the POV of the flower being plucked by a human. Like, it's something that anything from our position, when we humans think of what's present and anthropomorphize anything around us, we can then capture that certain presence, if you will, and kind of package it in a way, contort it in a way that it recalls that it's that type of presence, and in that certain context that packaging goes into, it can then open up that essence, that memory of what it is, so to speak. So to the care. So there's a certain orientation in my mind that, from a human perspective, kind of encapsulates non-being within the notion of basically the zip file opening. So when the zip file opens, like when you play a song, like, what happens a lot in a song is it starts with a certain pattern in the beginning of the song, and then by the end, that pattern is subsumed in a greater pattern that kind of just like amplifies the initial pattern that it started with. And in a certain sense, the song just shows how, like, this notion of non-being is hard to really detect, because you can really kind of extend what already is present in the song in a so many different ways, that when you hear a good song and it kind of compounds that initial pattern in the beginning, it's like, oh my God, that is beautiful. It's like a symphony, how it all just comes together in one giant, and there's no other way that it could go. Like, this is perfect the way it is. Like, it's hard to fathom doing it over again. That's why like the art of sampling is like an interesting art, because you have to kind of like, again, contort it. You have to package it in a certain way where it holds the initial song in a certain sense, but also brings forth a different element of that, I guess, initial song. What that initial song was bringing forth. So it's still holding that initial element. So yeah, I just think I think being as a zip file opening, absolutely. And I guess I just want to close by saying that maybe you can argue that the non-being is the fact that like, oh, the initial song, like just to go back to the song example, that initial song has a certain pattern, but I hear that if I contort that pattern in a certain way, I can bring forth this different song that captures that essence, but in a different way, but it's still part of the same essence that that initial song also had. Maybe the seeing of that possibility is the unveiling of non-being becoming being, so to speak. So maybe in that dimension of the creative process, that's where non-being is. It's in that initial seeing of what's not there. But it's still there. That's why I'm like, is that non-being? Because it's still there. It's still part of the form, the active form that being is. But I'll pass it off.
Thank you, Mr. Luber. I'll give it to Chetan, Mr. Joggin. Javier, so good to see you.
I've enjoyed your recent work on form and depth drive and different things, and it makes me think a little bit about intrinsic motivation. One of the reasons why I find intrinsic motivation so interesting is because when you're, say, intrinsically motivated by something, you're also in the present moment reaching back to all the times in the past you also did the intrinsically motivated thing. Say it's like writing, for example, of books. It's interesting how that kind of brings a kind of storied feel to it. Like you're saying, the zip file, the present is always kind of an unfolding of previous things, and previous things kind of inform the present. And it's almost like, for me, I guess I get so obsessed with the topic of intrinsic motivation because it seems to be so philosophically rich on all of these different topics and has that kind of back and forthness like music. And I like the example of the Jaws theme with the flower petal. But Mr. Chetan, please.
Yeah. I just sort of, I think one of the first things that comes to my mind is when you're discussing the question of recollection. I think there's something very interesting happening with recollection and repetition. So say until Freud, Kierkegaard, we didn't really understand this problem that well, because we always thought that recollection happens through repetition. And suddenly, sort of with Freud, this radical break comes in and he says, you repeat precisely because you don't remember. You in that sense. And you repeat compulsively more you don't remember. And to remember that repetition has to, in some senses, be, overcome it. That has to be brought to the surface in that sense. And what psychoanalytic thinking about it is. But this problem of recollection, remembering, actually has very close links with this question of repetition in that manner. And that's, I think, the first kind of a problematic that emerges, that recollection and remembrance has to be taught not as simply repetition, but as something which has this contradictory or antagonistic relationship with repetition. In that sense, which is why it's such a radical problem, because you may not remember something even when you are consciously made to remember it, if you are compulsively repeating it. And a lot of times that happens. A lot of times, no matter how hard we try and remember something, we'll forget it because we are compulsively repeating that thing. Isn't it? That kind of a problematic, I think, that emerges in that sense. I think second, one thing I just wanted to share with you all. There's a short story in my head which I think is relevant over here in the discussion. I'll not sort of take too much of your time, but like 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes probably. I had this, I have met many sort of, I was always fascinated with lives of musicians. I couldn't play anything, I couldn't sing anything. And as a kid, and today also, I'm like fascinated with them. I just want to hang out with them in that sense, be near them in one way or the other. I find my excuse to do it. But as a kid, as a young kid, sort of kid growing up in Delhi, I had few friends who were from the music industry at that time, being DJs and so on and so forth. And one of them was this person who used to be really good at music. So he'll come to your place and he'll bring his drugs along and so on and so forth. And he'll initially sort of really impress you with playing music. He'll come, he'll jam with you, he'll show you music, and he'll sort of create this environment. And you'll be like completely bought into it. Slowly, what he'll start doing is he'll start bringing harder drugs to your place. Slowly, what will happen, one day he'll bring some girl with him and say his girlfriend and so on and so forth, and he needs a room to have sex, and and then that process will start. And you know that music is a way, or though that rhythm that he's sort of bringing with him is a way through which he is slowly sort of taking control of your daily routines and lives and so on and so forth. And I've sort of encountered this figure again and again. This figure actually has a very close intimacy, and I wanted to write about it at some point. I want to write a short story on this figure. So this figure cannot exist without the dimension of music in it, in that sense. But music here is not this radically emancipatory thing. It is this very that emancipatory side also exists. I know a lot of people of that nature also. But I'm saying there is this dimension to it also, in that sense, which is linked to what you may call repetition automatism, which is linked to this compulsive side of things, in that sense, where you compulsively repeating through music. What is that question like? And I think we all have encountered those people at different points in our lives. We all have encountered people who can use music for this kind of repetition compulsion. How do we think through the problem of music within that kind of thinking, and what does the character actually signify to us in today's time, in that sense? Yeah.
That's a lovely comment. I'm thinking about the GoldenEye movie where he gives a free sample of crack, and then you're addicted, and then you have to buy it. So it's like, hey, listen to this music, man, and pulls you in. It also makes me wonder if, like, in the past, music was contained to religion or like social events, because once it's unleashed, it can be used for all these purposes, or it can be used to put on headphones and make you the protagonist in your story and everyone else is irrelevant. In the same way that Zapancha talks about like sex being restricted to marriage to contain the negativity, if it's like music was contained to keep it from being used in all these different ways. And I really like the point as well on the recollection, repetition, and the Freudian point. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Jockin.
I mean, I'm building what Chetan's saying. The idea is, when basically it's a self-reflective image, false image that you're repeating back on yourself, I'm not surprised at all. But it can be destructive behavior. Not surprised at all about that. This idea, like John left, but this idea of crescendo of learning. All of us here in the philosophy circles, is it not true that basically when you first start this journey, you're basically useless? And your brain is struggling so hard just to keep up with what's happening and what's going on with these terms. You're basically useless. You can't even participate in the conversation. You don't even know what's going on. But I think in the philosophy training, which is what this is, it's wholly advancing. What's up with you, Daniel? What's up with that? I'm just saying there's a moment of almost like a gaining of fluency, and it's marked by when a discussion happens, that reminds me of this, and you just have this like what's called, John was here, automaticity. This basically fluency or automaticity of like the knowledge is not this external outside thing that's having to be recalled with struggle. It's already there with you this whole time. And that's true with any discipline. Like in your discipline, you actually have a body of knowledge. In fact, one of the demonstrations of it is your fluency of commanding the terms and understand framings and models of it without any hesitations or struggling with it. So I'm just reminded of that. This kind of this, we're talking about like what's the sign of this crescendo of learning is actually in the philosophy circles when you're actually able to contribute, when you're actually able to recall with the way of contribution, understanding something. And that's true with all the disciplines, I would say, for any training. And then there's a subtle detail with that. Then that idea of intrinsic motivation. It's recently I was just reading about Aquinas, his essays on love. Very fascinating. He had 3 accounts of it, or 3 models of it, and the basic distinction about it was this reference point of yourself to the other you're wishing the good on. There's one where you basically, it's almost called hard heart. It's a solid heart, where you're basically bound within yourself. Then there's what's called ecstasy. So there's a kind of elation, there's kind of an understanding something beyond you fall in love with, wishing for union. But You're aware, but you're aware of the excess that's beyond you. Then the last one is a fascinating language. It's called liquefaction, where that love for the other compels one to basically release the solidity of oneself and conform oneself to the beloved. My image when I was reading that section was the idea of like when you love a discipline, right? You're shaped by it. You almost self-forget yourself, which is ecstasy would point to that too. But you're still within yourself. You're not willing to change yet. So the idea of intrinsic motivation, basically what we're getting in education, ideally it's supposed to be you fall in love with the topic, and that falling in love is like you literally get shaped by it. So your soul actually gets shaped and defined by that excess that's beyond you. Just meditating on that point, which is fascinating. Aquinas had those essays about it.
What was that term again that you said? Look, master. What was that term, Mr. Jockin?
I'll have to pull my notes. So the third mode was liquefaction. It's literally liquid, like liquid love.
Liquidification. That's a very useful term. I was not for, and I'm also
I'll give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. The auto mastery, the term that you're referring there about just kind of going and flowing and so on and so forth, I cannot help but think a lot of times I'll talk about flow, the cipher, so on and so forth. That basically is for me the point in many respects, like that ability, because that's the dance, right? That's the beauty, that's the movement of the spears. That, to me, there's a way in which the music, when you start education with music, it's like evidence of the possibility of auto mastery. See, look, things can flow. Look, things can go together. This is what we're trying to achieve, the ability of moving into a state of auto mastery where you just go with it without even realizing it, because that's what you see in a cipher. That's what you see in great art. That's what you see in a dance. And I think that kind of terminology is very, very useful, because then there's almost a sense, and I'll give it to Javier Rivera, and I fear I must go in about 15 minutes, but this is delightful. There's a real way in which the forms are auto mastery, like a cup is seeking the auto mastery of being a cup, right? Like a human is seeking the auto mastery of being a human being. There's a certain, like, the form of a thing when it's formulating itself, following its kind of orbit and trajectory, like at the end of book 7 of the Republic, then it's in its auto mastery of itself. And you're just going with it. And so that's and yeah, the point of education is to be able to just go through the auto mastery, right? It's this weird thing which you're a really good mechanic if you can fix the toilet without thinking about it. You're a really good dancer if you can dance without thinking it. You think really hard to get to the place where you don't have to think, right? You're just in auto mastery. So it's very curious to think of the point of education is to get to a place where you don't have to think because you've thought well enough to engage in a certain auto mastery. So I think it's a lovely term, and it's very interesting to associate forms with auto mastery and formulation with auto mastery and music as a kind of, you start education with music because that's proof of the possibility of flow, possibility of formulation, possibility of auto mastery. And then the kids go, oh, that's why we're learning to be in the image and likeness of music as such. So that's a very interesting language. Let me give it to Javier. Hey, Javier, how you doing?
Yeah. So yeah, I've been reading a lot of Julie Resch's work. And she's got me all hooked up on the death drive. Because I'm really fascinated by the way that she wants to make it central. And she's so adamant about making it central. She seems to be really pushing on this idea of, like, it's so hard to talk about the death drive because everybody wants to fall back on some type of enjoyment. Everybody wants to fall back and make it secondary to jouissance, pleasure, anything like that. And she's really trying to centralize it. And I just finished a talk that McGowan and her had. And I thought there was something very interesting to connect with music in this regard. McGowan defines death drive as the drive towards loss. And I think that's really fascinating because when you think about music, it's almost like there is a kind of loss that needs to be heard that is repeating itself. And I think that's very something. I think there is something about music, and I feel like it's a hunch right now, that there is something intimate with music and the death drive. And McGowan did say something interesting where he said, you know, how do we incorporate the death drive? Like, how do we stay true to this death drive? And he said the beautiful, which I thought was fascinating, because that's what Plato said. Well, that's what Socrates, Plato's Socrates said in the Phaedo, when he's like, yeah, I've stopped wondering how a man grows because I figured out I actually don't know. I don't know if it's generation or degeneration. I don't know if it's division or multiplication. I don't know. But what I do know is that there is this form, there's this aim, there's this, you can aim towards the beautiful. And so I thought that was very fascinating. And so far my theory is that actually Socrates is the perfect representation of the death drive, but Plato covers it over. He covers it over with the dialogue because it's too much. It's fundamentally too strong as a thing. But yeah, I do think there is something fundamental. To me, it's not a coincidence that McGowan says that the artist is something that is generally knows the death drive. And why is that? Why does the artist know the death drive? Why do they seem to have a more intimate relation with the death drive? And so I think if we're talking about music, there has to be something about loss in this idea. But of course, music now has become a positive project where you can earn. And this was Julie Reshi's kind of counter rebuttal, right? Like music and artistry has become now a kind of positive project where an artist can earn their income and they can gain benefits and celebrity status and everything like that. So, but McGowan kind of rebutted back and says, actually, well, it's not beauty can't be a benefit. It can't give you a benefit afterwards. It has to just be the beauty of the process itself. So that already made me believe that, yeah, there is something very intimate to music and art in the death drive. But yeah, that's just my points.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. I'll give it to Chetan. So now I'm thinking about, in French, the orgasm is the little death. Is there a little death in music? The climax, is the story have a little death in it? Then, of course, Todd McGowan and the Cadell, we talked about how the difference between lack and loss, and that you have to go through loss to get to the place of lack, which then becomes kind of essential. And then the question becomes the ontological choice of that. So there's a bunch of little terms I'm throwing out. And that one has to go through. And hot take on Socrates there. Look forward to that. There you go. So there we go. But let me give it to Mr. But it is interesting to think of the relation of there's something about music that you want to die into, like you want to lose yourself in. Is that it? But it is curious. What's the difference between wanting to get lost in God, lost in the beautiful, and dying in a kind of maybe more anti-natalist sense? I guess that's non-existence or anti-life. Like, is there a difference between those? But anyway, Chetan, please.
Thank you. Yeah. Javier is here. Yeah, somebody's talking to me with that drive. I like this. So I started a discussion with Paul later actually, which is why I'm so happy. So so that is where I started this idea that if you think about this problem of the unconscious, and if you ask this question that unconscious is not in the depth, but it is in the displacement, that is, it hides itself. One way to hide something is to hide it. Like in the story Paul letter, you hide it some deep somewhere inside, some crack. You hide the letter. The other is when you hide the letter in plain sight. And the question that Lacan asks is, how do you hide something in plain sight? Through displacement, through its movement. That is how and that is what death drive is all about, essentially. And that's a question of repetition, automatism in that sense. And there is something of the quality of rhythm attached to that movement. That movement cannot happen without its rhythm. Am I right? There's something, that movement, as Lacan himself sort of shows to the odd and even game, that movement always retroactively creates its own grammar. It cannot happen that it is in that sense you say the statement, a letter will always reach its destination. I think one of the things where I think Javier, you're saying, I think you're absolutely right, that there's something about it there. I'm not saying I've worked it out, but there's something about that if it creates language retroactively through creation of grammar, it also creates a space for rhythm in music. And what is that space all about? That's one. I think music also in that sense moves through both these dimensions, which is repetition and remembrance. There is a way, or there is rhythm to repeating something compulsive. There is also rhythm to remember. And rhythm works through both these. It cuts across in that sense. And that's something you have to be really honest about in that sense. And you can feel it also. Sometimes certain music will sort of, helps you move from repetitions to remembrance, and certain movement will help you, certain kind of music will help you move from remembrance to repetitions. It will make you more compulsive, it will make you more, there is something to that. I think the third point which I want to sort of bring from this psychoanalytic question is this follow unconscious of the other in that sense. And how do we think through that? I think music is one thing, and I've been thinking about it in one of my Facebook posts, this question of inside outside. And I was sort of trying to argue that if you think about hierarchies, especially if you think about rituals, religious hierarchies, and so on and so forth, they, in their most compulsive ways, actually help you assimilate the outside better. The more you've ordered the inside, more you've sort of brought in rationality on the inside, the more outside have been blocked to us. Which is what, everybody has been sort of saying that. Music is something which is very interesting because its hierarchies, its rhythms actually come from the outside. If they're completely determined from the inside, it's not music at all. It can be tune. It cannot be music. Music is something which is determined predominantly from, its rhythms can be retroactively known to us. But there is no logic why one rhythm is this way and not the other way. Which is why music actually, as human beings, predominantly comes to us in sounds. But if you think about it, music rhythms actually exist in visual mediums also. Even if you put your hand on a table and move it across, that has a rhythm without the sound itself. And many blind people sort of can feel the rhythms and deaf people that feel the rhythms and so on and so forth. Rhythm actually has much interesting space there. And music actually assimilates the outside better precisely for this reason. That its hierarchy, its logic is not fully determined from the inside. It is in that sense, it's contrasted with reason. In that sense, and language sort of has opening for both sides, reason on one side and music on the other. There's something about this story which I think we need to unravel. I'm not sure how Javier you think about it. Yeah.
That's a lovely comment. I'm taken by this thinking of reason and music, outside, inside, and also the deaf tribe. There is something interesting too, I guess, if we were speaking memory, like in order to engage in memory, there's a kind of way in which you have to kill the present a little bit to go back or to bring forth. So it's interesting to think of some kind of death that's part of that. It's also interesting to think of how in music, they're like when the kids just start dancing, it's almost like the inside is trying to conform with the outside instead of like be out, like inside to the outside. There's a lot that's very interesting there. And I'm taken by this kind of reason in music, language, the point that you're making. It's like, I guess now I'm even thinking about like Chronicles of Narnia, where like Aslan sings the universe into existence. Like everything is music, everything has rhythm, everything has vibrations, everything is music. So then maybe like Plato being like, hey, we have to start with music is like starting with what reality is actually like. And it's closer to music than it is just information on a page or something, or just random facts. But that's very interesting. Let me give it to Mr. Luber, and then I fear I will have to run. Blitz, Chetan, please.
Daniel, string theory.
Yeah.
That has the same insight. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, if it vibrations all the way down, and then it's also too like music is also inherently relational. Like music only works if notes relate to other notes and relates to rhythm and environment. So there's something about music that, well, music is always a kind of Leibniz, as I talked about, situation based on Mr. Morley. It's a whole situation, not merely a single digit. So it's very interesting. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, please.
I don't want to be too long because I know you got to go. I'm just thinking when I'm listening to a song in the car, like I'm on my way to the gym, trying to get pumped, like, getting ready. It's not that I'm losing my unpumped self, so to speak, because the pumped me is always in me, so to speak. It's just, I feel like there's not a loss in music because you can't like lose experience. Like, what am I just going from one type of experience to another? experience, like from if you were to use the word experience, basically, it just seems like you can't really talk about loss because you're just talking about the difference. So like from an experience point of view, there is no, in my opinion, such thing as loss, but difference. So it's because every possible experience, in a sense, I've like presupposed all possible experiences in a certain sense. I just bring them forth, different triggers or whatever, different environments or ways of addressing myself. But I just wonder what the death drive is in terms of like experience, I guess. But I mean that is probably a whole conversation for next time.
I'm so glad you said all that because we almost went through an entire net conversation without a Hegel reference. Oh gosh, that would have been bad. So yeah, there's a negation sublation, right?
That's to me that's Heidegger. I get so I don't know.
That's
are
okay.
They the same person? It sounds like they're the same.
I mean, they're H's,
I haven't
right?
read it.
I mean, they both go with an
That's
H.
true.
It's probably not a coincidence. But there's also something to be said about loss is difference if chosen, right? And this comes back to the chosen to be seen as such. So this comes back to the primacy of choice and different things like that, as we've talked about before and Javier has mentioned. And yeah, we have to experience like different, and then the entire on like the Science of Logic conference on with Leibniz, where the only thing we can ever experience is difference. Like two things can't be totally identical or they'd be the same thing. So all we can ever confirm is difference. How do we confirm difference and not believe that's a loss of sameness or a loss of someone, but in fact some sort of negation sublation of music? Because music is only possible because of difference, right? Like if you only had the note of A, then you couldn't have music. If you only had like rhythm and you didn't have all the other parts, music is a testament to difference. And if music is most fundamental, or we see something about all of the cosmos that has some sort of image and likeness to music, then that would all be a testament to the possibility of harmony. As I talk about harmony versus unity, oneness, symphony orchestra, and that would suggest a need for us to philosophically condition ourselves to be something more akin to music and harmony than some sort of blob of unified oneness. And I just love, in closing, I just want to imagine you in your car going, "Eye of the tiger, dun, 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 getting pumped, gonna lift stuff. We had a net conversation about music, so I'm going to sing Eye of the Tiger. Going to the gym. I don't actually know the words, but I just really enjoy that we could end the net with some music and the image of you going to the gym, recalling of which the essence of you going to the gym was being in a car going through Rocky Balboa. So it's really, really great. But gentlemen, thank y'all for being here today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Javier, you're great. Mr. Joggin, Chetan, Mr. Luber, y'all have a good one.